What if a killer could stalk the shadows of a city, leaving behind a trail of dismembered bodies so gruesome that even the bravest detectives would shudder at the sight? A killer so cunning that he would vanish into history without ever being caught.
That's the terrifying reality of the Cleveland Torso murders, a series of brutal killings that gripped Cleveland, Ohio. In the 1930s, a dark chapter in American history that introduced the world to a monster known only as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Let's set the stage. It's the height of the Great Depression, a time when the United States was reeling from economic collapse, with millions out of work, families struggling to survive, and cities like Cleveland bearing the brunt of poverty, crime, and despair. Cleveland in the 1930s was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was an industrial powerhouse with towering smokestacks and bustling factories. But on the other, it was a city of desperation, where the downtrodden lived in makeshift shantytowns along the Cuyahoga River, in a desolate area known as Kingsbury Run, a place that would soon become synonymous with terror. The Mad Butcher targeted the most vulnerable members of society: vagrants, sex workers, drifters, and the homeless, people who had already been forgotten by the world, making his crimes even harder to solve, as their disappearances often went unreported for weeks or even months. His method was chillingly consistent. He would dismember his victims with surgical precision, often decapitating them, removing their limbs, and sometimes even burning their remains to obscure their identities, leaving their torsos scattered across Cleveland in vacant lots, riverbanks, and ravines, a macabre display that seemed designed to taunt the police and terrify the public. This wasn't just a series of murders. It was a reign of terror that lasted from 1934 to 1938, claiming at least 12 confirmed victims, though some experts believe the true number could be as high as 20, a killing spree that exposed the dark underbelly of a city in crisis and challenged the limits of 1930s law enforcement. The Cleveland Torso murders baffled investigators, including the legendary Eliot Ness, the man who had famously brought down Al Capone in Chicago, but who would meet his match in this elusive killer, a killer who seemed to know exactly how to cover his tracks and evade capture.
Who was the Mad Butcher? Was he a doctor with a twisted mind, using his medical knowledge to dissect his victims with horrifying precision? Or perhaps a butcher, skilled with a cleaver and driven by a thirst for blood? Or could he have been a drifter, a phantom who moved through Cleveland undetected, preying on the city's most vulnerable before disappearing into the night?
In this video, we're diving deep into the Cleveland Torso murders, one of the most gruesome and perplexing unsolved cases in American history, a case that has haunted true crime enthusiasts, historians, and investigators for nearly a century. We'll explore every chilling detail, from the timeline of the murders and the discovery of the first victims to the investigation that followed, the suspects who were never convicted, and the theories that have kept this mystery alive for decades. We'll also examine the impact on Cleveland, a city that lived in fear for years, and the lasting legacy of a killer who was never brought to justice, a legacy that raises questions about how society treats its most vulnerable and how far we've come in the fight against crime. This is a story of horror, desperation, and the limits of justice, a story that forces us to confront the reality of evil in a time when the world was already on the brink of collapse, a time when the Great Depression had left millions struggling to survive, and a killer took advantage of that chaos to unleash his darkest impulses. Let's take a closer look at Cleveland in the 1930s, a city of smokestacks, shanties, and secrets, where the Mad Butcher began his deadly spree, leaving behind a trail of bodies that would shock the nation and cement his place in the annals of true crime history. Stick around as we unravel the mystery of the Cleveland Torso murders, a case that will leave you questioning how such a monster could operate for so long without being caught, and what it says about the society that failed to stop him.
Here's a question for you to think about. What's the most terrifying unsolved mystery you've ever heard? Have you ever come across a case that made you question how someone could commit such horrific acts and get away with it?
Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what keeps you up at night as we dive into this haunting tale of terror. Let's get started with the first gruesome discovery, a moment that would mark the beginning of Cleveland's darkest chapter, a chapter that would change the city forever.
Join the adventure. Subscribe now and unlock a world of exciting histories.
The nightmare that would become known as the Cleveland Torso Murders began on September 5th, 1934, a day that started like any other in Cleveland, but would end with the discovery so horrifying that it would mark the beginning of a city's descent into fear. A young boy named James Wagner, just 12 years old, was walking along the shores of Lake Erie near the East 49th Street beach, a popular spot for locals to fish and relax, when he noticed something unusual in the shallow water. A human torso, missing its head, arms, and legs, washed up on the shore like a grotesque piece of driftwood. James ran to get help, his screams echoing across the beach as he alerted nearby adults, who quickly called the police, setting off a chain of events that would plunge Cleveland into a state of panic and dread. The torso was identified as belonging to Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old man with a troubled past, known to frequent the seedy bars, brothels, and gambling dens of Kingsbury Run, a rough-and-tumble area where the city's outcasts gathered to survive the harsh realities of the Great Depression. Andrassy wasn't a saint. He had a reputation for petty crime, including theft and extortion, and was rumored to have ties to the local underworld, a fact that initially led police to believe his death might have been a mob hit, a theory they would soon abandon as more bodies began to surface. The coroner's report was chilling. Andrassy's body showed signs of meticulous dismemberment, with clean, precise cuts at the joints, suggesting the killer had experience with a blade, possibly a butcher's cleaver or a surgical scalpel, a detail that would become a haunting hallmark of the Mad Butcher's crimes. The decapitation was particularly gruesome. The head had been removed with such precision that it suggested the killer had taken their time, possibly even enjoying the process, a thought that sent shivers down the spines of investigators who were already struggling to make sense of the crime. Just weeks later, on September 23rd, 1935, the horror escalated when two more bodies were discovered in Kingsbury Run itself, a desolate stretch of land filled with rail yards, ravines, and makeshift shelters, a place where the city's poorest residents lived in squalor, far from the eyes of Cleveland's more affluent citizens. These victims were two men, both decapitated, their torsos found just 30 feet apart, their heads later discovered nearby, wrapped in old newspapers, a macabre gift left for the police to find, a taunt that seemed to say,
"Catch me if you can, because I'm just getting started."
The police were stunned. The lack of blood at the scene suggested the murders had taken place elsewhere, with the bodies carefully transported and dumped in Kingsbury Run to be discovered, a pattern that pointed to a killer who was both methodical and brazen, unafraid of being caught despite the increasing police presence in the area. The victims were never fully identified, earning the grim nicknames Victim 0 and Victim 1. Their anonymity a stark reminder of how the Mad Butcher preyed on those society had already forgotten, people whose disappearances went unnoticed until their remains were found, making the investigation even more challenging. Detectives noted the similarities between the murders, the clean cuts, the decapitations, the deliberate placement of the bodies, all of which suggested a single killer with a distinct modus operandi. A killer who was not only skilled with a blade, but also deeply sadistic, taking pleasure in the act of dismemberment and the terror it inspired. The coroner's findings added another layer of horror. Both victims had been killed by decapitation while still alive, a detail that indicated the killer wanted them to suffer, to feel every moment of their agonizing deaths, a level of cruelty that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The city of Cleveland was on edge. Rumors of a headhunter began to spread like wildfire, whispered in bars, on street corners, and in the shanty towns of Kingsbury Run, where residents started locking their doors at night, a precaution that was rare in a community where survival often meant sleeping on the streets with nothing but a tattered blanket for protection. One local resident, a woman named Mary Thompson, later recalled the atmosphere of fear that gripped the area, saying,
"We all knew something evil was out there. You could feel it in the air, like a storm was coming, but instead of rain, it brought death."
A sentiment that captured the growing dread that permeated Cleveland as the body count began to rise. The first murders set the stage for a killing spree that would terrorize the city for years, a spree that would challenge the limits of 1930s forensics, expose the vulnerabilities of a society already struggling to survive, and test the resolve of a police force that was ill-equipped to handle a killer of this magnitude.
What drove the Mad Butcher to commit such atrocities? Was this a crime of passion, a personal vendetta against the victims, or a calculated act of sadism by a predator who thrived on fear and chaos? And most importantly, how could someone kill with such brutality and still remain a ghost, leaving no trace of their identity behind?
Let's dive deeper into the investigation that followed. An investigation that would bring in one of America's most famous lawmen, only to see him fail in the face of this elusive and terrifying killer. By the summer of 1936, the Cleveland Torso murders had become a full-blown crisis, with the body count rising and the city's fear reaching a boiling point, as residents demanded answers and safety in a time when both seemed impossible to achieve. The Cleveland Police Department was under immense pressure to catch the Mad Butcher, a killer who had already claimed at least 5 victims, each murder more gruesome than the last, and each one a stark reminder of the police's failure to stop him. Enter Eliot Ness, the famed lawman who had brought down Al Capone in Chicago during the Prohibition era, a man whose name was synonymous with justice, and who had recently been appointed as Cleveland Safety Director, tasked with overseeing public safety and leading the fight against crime in a city that was spiraling out of control. Ness was a celebrity in law enforcement circles. His exploits in Chicago had made him a national hero, and his arrival in Cleveland in 1935 was seen as a beacon of hope for a city desperate for a savior. But the Torso murders would prove to be his greatest challenge, a case that would test his skills, his resolve, and his reputation like never before. Ness was determined to stop the killer, assembling a team of Cleveland's best detectives, including seasoned investigators like Peter Marilow and Martin Zalewski, who had been working the case since the first body was found and ordering round-the-clock patrols in Kingsbury Run, hoping to catch the butcher in the act or at least deter him from striking again. But the killer was elusive. He seemed to know the city's underbelly better than the police did, striking in the dead of night, often in areas that were difficult to patrol, like the ravines and rail yards of Kingsbury Run, where the homeless lived in makeshift shelters, far from the reach of law enforcement. The investigation faced significant challenges. Many of the victims were transients, drifters, and vagrants, people who had no family to report the missing, making identification a near impossible task in an era before DNA testing, when fingerprints were the primary method of identification, and even those were often useless if the victim's hands were missing, as they often were in these cases. Forensic technology in the 1930s was rudimentary at best. Detectives relied on physical evidence like bloodstains, footprints, and witness statements, but the Mad Butcher left little behind, often cleaning the bodies of any blood and dumping them in locations where evidence would be washed away by rain or contaminated by the elements. One detective, Peter Marilow, later wrote in his memoirs about the frustration of the case, saying,
"We were chasing a ghost. Every lead we followed turned into a dead end, and every time we thought we were close, another body would turn up, mocking our efforts."
A sentiment that captured the growing despair within the police department as the murders continued unabated. In June 1936, the horror escalated yet again when another victim was found. A woman whose torso was discovered floating in the Cuyahoga River. Her head, arms, and legs never recovered. A grim discovery that earned her the nickname, the Lady of the Lake, a moniker that belied the brutality of her death. The Lady of the Lake was different from the previous victims. She was the first confirmed female victim, a fact that suggested the Mad Butcher was expanding his target pool, no longer limiting himself to men, a development that sent a new wave of fear through Cleveland's female population, particularly those who lived or worked in the city's red light districts. The coroner's report on the Lady of the Lake revealed even more disturbing details. Her torso showed signs of chemical burns, suggesting the killer had used a corrosive substance, possibly lime or acid, to destroy evidence and hasten decomposition, a tactic that further complicated the investigation and pointed to a killer who was not only sadistic, but also highly intelligent, aware of how to cover his tracks. Eliot Ness took drastic measures in an attempt to stop the killings. In August 1938, he ordered a massive raid on Kingsbury Run, where police rounded up hundreds of homeless residents, burned down their shantytowns, and searched the area for any sign of the killer. A controversial move that displaced countless people and drew sharp criticism from the public, who accused Ness of punishing the victims rather than catching the perpetrator. The raid was a failure. No significant evidence was found, and the killings continued, leaving Ness to face a barrage of criticism in the press, with newspapers like the Cleveland Plain Dealer running headlines that questioned his competence, one of which read, "Ness burned shantytowns, but Butcher still at large," a headline that captured the public's growing frustration with the investigation. The pressure on Ness was immense. His reputation as an untouchable lawman was crumbling, and the Torso murders were becoming a stain on his legacy, a case that he would later describe as the most frustrating of his career, a case that would haunt him long after he left Cleveland. The investigation also revealed the systemic failures of 1930s law enforcement, from the lack of coordination between different police departments to the social stigma that devalued the lives of the victims, many of whom were seen as undesirables by society, a bias that meant their deaths were not given the attention they deserved. The Mad Butcher's ability to evade capture raised chilling questions about his identity and his methods.
How could someone kill so brazenly, in a city that was now on high alert, and still remain a phantom, leaving no witnesses, no fingerprints, no trace of his existence? Why couldn't the police catch him? Was the Mad Butcher a local, hiding in plain sight among Cleveland's residents, or a drifter who moved through the city undetected, striking and then disappearing before the police could close in?
And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, was he still out there, waiting for the right moment to kill again? Let's explore the theories and suspects that emerged as investigators tried to unmask the monster behind the Cleveland Torso murders, a monster who seemed to thrive on the chaos and fear he created. As the Cleveland Torso murders continued, the investigation took on a new urgency, with detectives desperate to develop theories about the Mad Butcher's identity, hoping to find a pattern or a clue that could lead them to the killer before he struck again. The surgical precision of the cuts was one of the most striking aspects of the murders. The clean dismemberments, the removal of heads, and the careful disposal of body parts all suggested a killer with a deep knowledge of anatomy, someone who knew exactly how to use a blade to achieve their gruesome goals. One leading theory was that the Mad Butcher was a medical professional, possibly a surgeon, a doctor, or even a mortician, someone with the skills and tools to perform such precise dismemberments, a theory that led police to question dozens of local medical professionals, including doctors, nurses, and even medical students, in the hopes of finding a suspect with a dark side. Another theory suggested that the killer might be a butcher by trade, someone accustomed to handling meat and skilled with a cleaver, a profession that would give them access to the tools needed for dismemberment and a familiarity with cutting through bone, a theory that prompted police to investigate Cleveland's meatpacking industry, interviewing butchers and slaughterhouse workers across the city. A third theory pointed to a drifter, a transient who moved through Kingsbury Run unnoticed, preying on the homeless, and then leaving the city before the police could close in, a lifestyle that would explain the lack of witnesses and the killer's ability to disappear without a trace, a theory that was difficult to pursue given the transient nature of the population in Kingsbury Run, where people came and went without leaving records. A key suspect emerged in 1939, Frank Dolezal, a 52-year-old bricklayer with a history of violence and alcoholism, who was arrested after being linked to one of the victims through a tenuous connection, a woman who had been seen with him shortly before her disappearance, a woman whose torso was later found in Kingsbury Run, her identity confirmed through a tattoo on her thigh. Dolezal's arrest was controversial. Many believed he was a scapegoat, a convenient target for a police department desperate to show progress in the case, especially since the evidence against him was circumstantial at best, consisting mainly of witness statements that placed him in the area and a supposed confession that he later recanted, claiming he had been coerced by police. Dolezal's death in custody added fuel to the controversy. On August 24, 1939, he was found hanged in his cell at the Cuyahoga County Jail, a death that was officially ruled a suicide, but which many suspected was the result of police brutality, as an autopsy revealed broken ribs and signs of a struggle, injuries that were inconsistent with the self-inflicted hanging. The public outcry was immediate. Newspapers ran stories questioning the police's handling of the case, with headlines like,
"Did police kill Dolezal to close the torso case?"
fueling public distrust and raising questions about whether the real killer was still at large, a question that would haunt the investigation for years to come. Another suspect, Dr. Francis Sweeney, a former surgeon with a history of alcoholism, mental instability, and a known fascination with dismemberment, became a prime focus for Eliot Ness, who had become obsessed with the case and saw Sweeney as the most likely candidate for the Mad Butcher. Sweeney's background was troubling. He had served as a surgeon during World War I, where he had performed amputations under battlefield conditions, giving him the anatomical knowledge needed for the dismemberments, and he had a history of erratic behavior, including violent outbursts and periods of institutionalization for mental health issues. Ness subjected Sweeney to intense interrogation, even using an early form of a lie detector test, which Sweeney reportedly failed, showing signs of deception when asked about the murders, but there was no hard evidence to tie him to the crimes, no murder weapon, no witnesses, no physical evidence linking him to the scenes, and Sweeney's family connections to a prominent Cleveland politician made him a difficult target for prosecution. Sweeney was never charged, and he spent the later years of his life in and out of mental institutions, dying in 1964 without ever confessing to the murders, though Ness remained convinced of his guilt until his own death in 1957, often telling colleagues,
"I know it was him. I could see it in his eyes."
A belief that was based more on intuition than evidence, leaving Sweeney as one of the most enduring suspects in the case. Other theories emerged over the years. Some speculated that the Mad Butcher might have been a woman, a theory based on the fact that several victims were men who might have been lured by a female killer, though this idea was largely dismissed due to the physical strength required for the dismemberments. Another theory suggested a connection to organized crime, with the murders possibly being a message from the Cleveland mob to keep the city's underworld in line. But this theory fell apart when no clear motive or evidence emerged to support it, and the random nature of the victims made a mob connection unlikely. The lack of a clear suspect left the investigation in limbo, with detectives chasing shadows and the public growing increasingly frustrated as the Mad Butcher continued to kill. Each murder a reminder of the police's failure to stop him, a failure that would define the case for decades.
What made the Mad Butcher so hard to catch? Was he a genius, a criminal mastermind who knew how to outsmart the police, or simply a lucky predator who took advantage of a broken system? And why did the killings seem to stop after 1938? Or did the Butcher simply move on to another city, continuing his reign of terror elsewhere?
Let's take a closer look at the height of the Mad Butcher's killing spree, a period that would push Cleveland to the brink and cement the Torso murders as one of the most horrifying unsolved cases in history. The years between 1936 and 1938 marked the height of the Mad Butcher's reign of terror, a period when the Cleveland Torso murders reached their most horrifying peak, with bodies turning up at an alarming rate, each discovery more gruesome than the last, and each one a stark reminder of the killer's unchecked brutality. By this point, the Mad Butcher had claimed at least 8 confirmed victims, though the true number was likely higher, as some remains were too decomposed or incomplete to be identified, a fact that added to the growing sense of dread that permeated Cleveland, a city that now lived in constant fear of the next gruesome find. One of the most shocking discoveries came on February 23, 1937, when a man walking near the East 9th Street Pier found a human torso wrapped in a burlap sack, floating in the icy waters of Lake Erie, the head and limbs missing, a sight that sent shockwaves through the city and reignited public panic, as it became clear that the killer was still active, still hunting, and still evading capture. The victim was a woman, later identified through a distinctive scar on her abdomen as Rose Wallace, a 40-year-old sex worker who had been reported missing months earlier. Her death a tragic reminder of the vulnerability of the women who worked in Cleveland's red light districts, women who were often the Mad Butcher's preferred targets. Rose Wallace's murder was particularly brutal. Her torso showed signs of prolonged torture, with deep cuts and burns that suggested she had been kept alive for hours, possibly even days, before her death, a level of sadism that horrified investigators and fueled speculation. The killer was not just a predator, but a true psychopath, someone who derived pleasure from the suffering of others. The coroner's report revealed another chilling detail. Rose had been dismembered with a heavy blade, likely a cleaver or an axe, but the cuts were so precise that they suggested the killer had taken their time, methodically separating her limbs with a care that bordered on obsession, a detail that reinforced the theory that the Mad Butcher had some form of medical or anatomical knowledge. The murders continued unabated. In April 1937, another torso was found in a ravine near Kingsbury Run, this time a man, his head discovered in a nearby ditch, his face so badly mutilated that identification was impossible, a grim addition to the growing list of unnamed victims, a list that was becoming a symbol of the police's failure to stop the killer. The public's fear reached a fever pitch. Newspapers ran sensational headlines like,
"Mad Butcher strikes again," and "Cleveland's headhunter claims another victim."
Each story accompanied by graphic descriptions of the crime scenes, descriptions that both horrified and fascinated readers, turning the Torso murders into a macabre spectacle that gripped the nation. Residents of Kingsbury Run were particularly terrified. Many refused to leave their shelters after dark, and those who did often traveled in groups, armed with whatever weapons they could find, from knives to makeshift clubs, a desperate attempt to protect themselves from a killer who seemed to strike at random, leaving no one safe. One resident, a man named John Carter, later shared his memories of that time, saying,
"We lived in constant fear. You never knew if you'd be next, if you'd wake up to find a body in the ditch outside your shack, or if the butcher would come for you in the night."
A statement that captured the paralyzing terror that defined life in Kingsbury Run during the height of the murder spree. The police were overwhelmed, despite Eliot Ness's efforts to increase patrols and follow up on every lead. The Mad Butcher seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, a phantom who could kill with impunity and then vanish without a trace, leaving behind only the mutilated remains of his victims as evidence of his presence. In August 1938, the killings reached a gruesome climax when two more bodies were found in a dump near East 9th Street. A man and a woman, their torsos placed side by side, their heads and limbs scattered nearby, a deliberate display that seemed designed to mock the police, who had been patrolling the area just hours before the bodies were discovered. This double murder was a turning point. It was the first time the Mad Butcher had killed two victims at once, a bold escalation that suggested he was growing more confident, more brazen, and perhaps even more desperate to be noticed, a psychological shift that intrigued investigators but also deepened their frustration, as they were no closer to catching him than they had been years earlier. The crime scene was a nightmare. The bodies were so badly decomposed that identification was impossible, but the coroner noted that both victims had been killed within days of each other, their torsos showing the same precise cuts and chemical burns that had become the Mad Butcher's signature, a signature that was now seared into the minds of every detective working the case. The double murder also marked a shift in public perception. While the earlier murders had been met with fear and outrage, this latest atrocity sparked a sense of resignation, as many Cleveland residents began to believe that the Mad Butcher would never be caught, that he was a force of evil that could not be stopped, a belief that only deepened the city's collective trauma. The reign of terror had a profound impact on Cleveland. It turned neighbors into suspects, as people began to eye each other with suspicion, wondering if the killer might be living among them, hiding in plain sight, a paranoia that eroded the sense of community that had once held the city together.
Why did the Mad Butcher escalate his killings? Was he taunting the police, trying to prove that he was untouchable? Or was he spiraling out of control, driven by a compulsion that he could no longer contain? And what would it take to stop him, if even a man like Eliot Ness, with all his resources and determination, couldn't bring him to justice?
Let's examine the aftermath of the Mad Butcher spree, the legacy of the Cleveland Torso murders, and the enduring mystery of a killer who was never caught, a mystery that continues to haunt true crime enthusiasts to this day. After the double murder in August 1938, the Cleveland Torso murders seemed to come to an abrupt and mysterious halt, with no new bodies discovered in the months and years that followed, a sudden cessation that left investigators and the public alike grappling with more questions than answers, as the Mad Butcher vanished into the shadows as quickly as he had emerged. The abrupt end to the killings was as baffling as the murders themselves. Some speculated that the Mad Butcher had been arrested for another crime, perhaps an unrelated offense that landed him in prison, where he either died or remained incarcerated, unable to continue his spree, a theory that offered a glimmer of hope, but no concrete evidence to support it. Others believed that the killer had simply moved on, leaving Cleveland to continue his reign of terror in another city, possibly under a different modus operandi, a theory that gained traction when similar unsolved murders were reported in nearby cities like Youngstown, Ohio, and even as far away as Los Angeles, where the Black Dahlia murder in 1947 bore eerie similarities to the Torso murders, though no definitive link was ever established. Another possibility was that the Mad Butcher had died. Perhaps he had been killed in an accident, succumbed to illness, or even taken his own life, a fate that would explain the sudden stop but also ensure that he would never face justice for his crimes. A bitter pill for the families of the victims, who were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. The Cleveland Torso murders left a lasting scar on the city. Kingsbury Run, once a bustling if impoverished community, became a ghost town in the years that followed, as residents fled the area, unwilling to live in a place so tainted by death and fear, a place that had become synonymous with the Mad Butcher's atrocities. The case also had a profound impact on Eliot Ness. Despite his success in bringing down Al Capone, the Torso murders became a stain on his legacy, a failure that haunted him for the rest of his life, as he often spoke of the case with a mix of frustration and regret, telling friends,
"I gave it everything I had, but the butcher was always one step ahead."
A sentiment that captured the toll the case had taken on him, both professionally and personally. The investigation officially went cold in the early 1940s as the Cleveland Police Department shifted its focus to other crimes, and the city tried to move on from the nightmare that had gripped it for so long. But the Torso murders were never forgotten, remaining a topic of fascination for true crime enthusiasts, historians, and amateur sleuths who continue to study the case to this day. Modern forensic techniques have offered new hope in recent years. Advances in DNA analysis have led some investigators to re-examine the few pieces of physical evidence that remain, including bone fragments and clothing found at the crime scenes, in the hopes of identifying the victims and possibly linking them to a suspect, though the passage of time and the degradation of evidence have made this a daunting task. In 2019, a team of researchers at Cleveland State University launched a project to re-examine the Torso murders, using modern technology to analyze the case files, crime scene photos, and coroner's reports, a project that has renewed public interest in the case and sparked new theories about the Mad Butcher's identity. Though no definitive answers have emerged, the case has also inspired countless books, documentaries, and even fictional works. Novelist James Ellroy wrote about the Torso murders in his book The Black Dahlia, drawing parallels between the two cases, while the 2018 graphic novel Torso by Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Andraco brought the story to a new generation, blending historical fact with dramatic storytelling to keep the mystery alive. The Cleveland Torso murders have become a symbol of the limits of justice in the 1930s, a time when forensic science was in its infancy, and societal biases often meant that the most vulnerable victims were overlooked, a systemic failure that allowed the Mad Butcher to kill with impunity, leaving behind a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. The mystery endures because of its sheer brutality and the enigma of the killer's identity. Unlike other famous serial killers, the Mad Butcher never left a manifesto, never taunted the police with letters, and never revealed his motives, making him a blank slate onto which investigators and the public have projected their darkest fears, a faceless monster who could be anyone, anywhere.
The case also raises deeper questions about society. How could a killer target the most vulnerable, the homeless, the forgotten, and go unnoticed for so long? What does it say about the Great Depression, a time when millions were struggling to survive, that a predator like the Mad Butcher could operate with such impunity, taking advantage of a broken system to satisfy his twisted desires?
The Cleveland Torso murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history, a grim reminder of the evil that can lurk in the shadows, and the challenges of bringing such evil to justice, especially in a time when the tools of law enforcement were so limited and the victims were so easily forgotten. As we reflect on this case, it's worth considering the lessons it teaches us about the importance of valuing every life, no matter how marginalized, and the need for justice systems that can protect the most vulnerable, lessons that are just as relevant today as they were in the 1930s, when the Mad Butcher terrorized Cleveland.
What do you think happened to the Mad Butcher? Do you believe he stopped killing, or did he simply move on to another city, continuing his spree under a different name? And what about the victims, whose names and stories were lost to history? How can we honor their memory and ensure that their deaths were not in vain?
Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your theories about this chilling case, and whether you think the Mad Butcher will ever be identified, even after all these years. If you found this video compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. We'll be diving into more unsolved mysteries and true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep asking questions, because sometimes the truth is out there, waiting to be uncovered, even in the darkest corners of history.